I ran into Mike, I think, on Pretty Green one day, and we got talking, and eventually we shared a flat for several years. And at that time he was a climber primarily, and he took me climbing in the Avon Gorge and terrified me, and I've never climbed again since then. But either he got tired of climbing or we'd had some row with the climbing fraternity, but he got keener and keener on caving. And when I first knew him, he'd hardly caved at all, and he'd certainly never dived, and he could hardly swim. Neither of us could, so he didn't like water. He'd hardly ever been in caves, so we went straight to cave diving, and I doubt he did more than half a dozen straight caving trips. And we came up against Dave Savage, who was at Bristol. He'd got a long pedigree of caving, and he was interested in again taking up diving to find more cave. And we came together as a trio, and we applied to join the cave diving group, and they didn't want to know. The cave diving group was moribund at that stage. After there'd been deaths earlier on, there was the controversy about going from oxygen to air, and there was no CDG really to join, and they didn't want to know us, even had we been able to join it. So we formed our own independent cave diving group, which sounded very grand. We had our own headed notepaper for reasons that escape me, because we had no money, and there were just 3 members. It lasted for 2 years, and the sole purpose really was to get to the end of Swildens and Stoke Lane Slough. It was Laurel and Hardy really, because none of us had any experience of diving. I think I had half an hour in a swimming pool beforehand, before my first cave dive, and the same was true of the other 2. So literally we learnt on the job, and mainly in Swildens Hole, and we were lucky to be alive. I almost perished in Sump 3 in Swildens. Mike got jammed and almost died in Stoke Lane, so it was absolutely living hand to mouth. Now Mike took it far more seriously, I think, than Dave and I did, the technicalities of diving and understanding what was going on. As far as Dave Savage and I were concerned, getting through the nasty bit underwater into passage was what we really wanted to do. But Mike, from the beginning, took the technical side very seriously, and he was always messing with equipment, changing this, changing that. So in a sense, he was always very focused on the technical side and getting things absolutely perfectly right. And that showed through in all his caving and all his diving. He was an utter perfectionist, absolutely shambolic in ordinary life, the messiest room you could ever hope to see. But when it came to equipment, he was utterly painstaking. We literally had no money, so all you could use were these tadpole small bottles, which gave you about 20 minutes if you breathed very calmly, and about 10 minutes if you didn't, and one valve, and the valves used to clog with silt and sand very often and jam, and you'd lose your air that way. Side mounted and no spares, partly I said because we couldn't afford it, but also almost all the sumps, this was Swildens and Cheddar and Stoke Lane, were very, very constricted, and the last thing you wanted was an extra set with you. So that was the independent cave diving group. After 2 years we became respectable, and we actually took tests and joined the proper cave diving group, but by then the impetus had gone, and the 3 of us actually went our own ways.
For a while, Mike was actually the secretary of the southern section of the cave diving group, but he never got on with establishment sort of figures, and there was some sort of dispute over his use of the Club Land Rover, and he basically got kicked out of the CDG down there, and his time in Mendip, more or less, was at an end.
The Mendip area was largely dived out as far as he was concerned. He was mainly concerned with Stoke Lane and Swildens, and they pushed Swildens all the way to Sump 12, and it was unlikely to go any further in the short term. He also fell out a little bit with members of the cave diving group down there, and of course Yorkshire was relatively unexplored as far as sump diving was concerned.
I first met Mike, and he was living at Bob Leakey's place up at Giggleswick, in a tiny little place, 2 rooms, about sort of 10-foot square a piece, if that. Neat little place in his yard up there, and he's a great help to me for sure. He's a bit like Jesus with a twinkle in his eye. And on his way home, he's gone from Settle to his place at Giggleswick. He passed the Settle High School, and could that boy turn the head of a 16-year-old at that time, for sure. Obviously done a lot of stuff in Swildens and working places like that, and as I say, moving to Yorkshire after a spell. He used to be a professional diver on the rigs. He worked for Divecon International, and so what Mike brought to diving at that time was a real professionalism, I thought, something that certainly cave diving needed at the time in the late 60s.
Sometime around the end of 1969, I was in the middle of the Lost River of Gaping Gill film, and I suddenly decided that I needed a good end for it, and Mike had arrived on the scene, and I thought, great, how about getting him to dive in Terminal Lake in Ingleborough?
I started caving because of climbing, actually. I had a lot of friends who were badly injured, a couple killed. I decided to have a go at caving. In caves, of course, when you're diving, you're in a passage which is often constricted, very, very dark, psychological aspect, fear. And you know, or you should know, that if anything goes wrong, you can't just ditch your gear and come up. The first times I dived in Ingleborough Cave, it was very much a working dive, but the results that came out of it and the atmosphere of the place and the potential, I'm very much involved with it.
As it happens, I knew that Ken Pearce had already dived the Sun and said it didn't go, it ended in a sandbank. And I thought, okay, fine, Mike disappears, comes back in half an hour or so, said it doesn't go. End of film, great.
I left you. Halfway through, you come into clear water, crystal clear water. It's just as if you're hanging there, suspended. Then up into chambers, big dry chambers. We must be fairly close now. We're about 500 feet from the terminal sump.
Then, of course, when Mike gets through into open passage, it put the cat among the pigeons with the BBC, incredibly, because how are we going to make this connection? We need this connection for the film. Let's bring in a rival diver. So enter Tom Brown.
But my approach was amateurist, to say the least. I mean, Mike's gear was always immaculate, and mine was held together by a bale of twine and an old leather belt. That was a tip I picked up from Ken Pearce, to be fair.
The cave divers brought in an air compressor for their cylinders so that they could dive into the flooded passages every day when the weather was right. For weeks, the daily routine for Mike and Tom was to check the gear, fill the air bottles, and go down again. There were so many caves to explore, they might break through tomorrow, or it might take years. All they could do was try.
Mike came up to Lancaster University in 1970 to read mathematics, mainly, so he said, so that he mistrusted the diving tables, and he felt that he could do a job in recalculating them.
Well, by this time we'd settled down in the approach to diving. We'd got our equipment reasonably sophisticated and secure. We were familiar with it, we knew what we could do with it. And we'd gradually inched up in the distances we were doing. And it suddenly became apparent that it wasn't air reserves or anything concrete that was limiting the distance of the dives. And if we took a long, hard look at it, it was obvious that it was purely a mental problem.
Schoolboy at the time, when I first heard of Mike's tremendous dive in Keld Head, and he'd already done his dives in Ingleborough Cave, but it became apparent that this was the first time that anyone had set off on an underwater journey into a cave, not looking to find airspace, and was regarded exploring underwater passage in its own right as something important. And it changed, I think, at that time, the mindset of every cave diver to come, that no longer were we just thinking of ducking our heads under and popping up into a new cave, but we're quite happy to stay underwater for long, long periods of time.
Mike was I was interested in the connection between, the potential connection between Gaping Gill and Igbra Cave ever since he was involved in the filming project. And when he was at Lancaster, he was particularly interested in the prospect of looking at the far end of Gaping Gill and exploring it from that direction. In 1972, he made an arrangement with to meet Mel Gascoigne, Dave Checkley and myself in Clapham so that we could go and have a look at the far end of Far Country. But the best laid plans of mice and men go awry, and I don't think we turned up on the right day. I can't remember. Anyway, it finished up that Mike finished up going down by himself, which was quite a remarkable trip. He hadn't been in far country before, and he made his way to Clay Cavern, had a look around Clay Cavern, removed a boulder, and exposed a hole which was a body-sized tube, which he inserted in himself, which was about 10 feet long, and he finished up over a 6-foot drop, dropped into that, and found the lower series of the far waters. A few days later, Mel Gascoigne, Dave Checkley and myself went to have a look, and we surveyed it, and I found an avon called Spiral Avon, which I climbed. And a few days after that, a larger party went in with Mike, and Mike and I arrived at Clay Cavern before anybody else, so we went to explore Spiral Avon and found Penny Arcade. And on that day, most of Far Waters was explored, apart from a very nasty duck at the end of one passage. During the CPC winch meet at August Bank Holiday, Mike went to have another look at the duck, and went down on the CPC tackle and made his way by himself to the duck, and he forced the duck and found Hallucination Avon, which he then climbed to a height of about 50 feet, I believe. And it was a long, hard trip. I think it was 19 hours or something. And when he got back to the entrance of Bar Pot, he discovered the ladder had been pulled up.
Mike rang me late afternoon, early evening, and the conversation went something like this. Jack, yeah, Mike, it's Mike Woodin. All right, Mike, what's the problem? Well, he said you'll be getting a phone call in a short while from someone who is involved in the winch meet. They're just in the process of de-rigging, and he said it'll be rather informing you that they believe that I'm trapped or lost down Gaping Gill. So I said, right. He said, so I'll leave you to deal with that in your own manner. He said, but what I'm telling you now is that I've managed to get out of Gaping Gill under my own steam. And he said, you'll understand when this guy has a conversation with you. So I said, right, okay, thanks very much. Sometime later, maybe an hour or two later, the phone rang again, came through the police at Skipton, and Mr. Pickup, can you ring this number at Clapham? There's a caver been reported missing in Gaping Gill system. So I rang this number and had a conversation with a chap there on the other end of the phone. And eventually we got round to sort of suggesting who the person was that was missing, and he said, well, it's a chap called Mike Woodin. And I sort of quite quickly, being in possession of what I've already told you, sort of said, oh, sod him, he deserves to be left down there, he's a bloody nuisance, you go and find him, he lives down the place, you go and find him, you see. And of course you can imagine that the chap on the other end of the phone that was reporting this incident was taken aback, but nonetheless, that was the end of the matter as far as I was concerned, because I knew Mike was out. Of course, a week or two later, we had a suitable letter from this particular caving club complaining about my attitude towards a reported incident. And of course, as it turned out, I was left to reply in a suitable manner, which I did. And of course, sometime later, I saw Mike. And I said, Mike, I've been thinking about what you did. I said, I find it rather incredible. I said, I've talked to one or two people. I said, and I'm staggered how you managed to climb out. And he said, Jack, I was that bloody annoyed when I got to Bar Pot and found it had been detattled on me. He said, I was absolutely livid. He said, I completely and utterly lost it. He said, I could have climbed up a sheet of glass. He said, I just climbed out of there, he said, in a state. He said, I've no doubt I took some risks, he said, but I got out.
Well, Mike used to commute from Settle to Lancaster on a motorbike every day. And in his final year, he had a very bad accident. I was in Venezuela at the time, so I didn't actually get to hear the details, but I do know that he injured his head and was very, very badly shaken up. It had these weird sort of effects, like he became very vulnerable to allergies, he used to have panic attacks, and that sort of thing. And later he developed ME, and he really was pretty poorly. And he didn't actually do much until the early 80s, when he started caving again. Well, in the 80s, Mike and I did a lot of caving together, and this was when all the SRT routes down the various caves were being developed, and we contributed to that, bolting in places like Nick Pot and so on and so forth, and doing all the old classics and thoroughly enjoying ourselves. We went to the Bergier a couple of times, but we didn't actually do a lot of new exploration. In the late 80s, because of domestic circumstances, he didn't find it quite so easy to get caving, and he started doing a lot of running. And then June became very poorly at the end of the 90s, and most of his energy was devoted to looking after her and keeping the household running. After June died, Mike was very down. Obviously, life had been very, very stressful for him for several years. And I started to drag him out again, and we started going for long walks, sort of spent all day sort of on the moors together. And after a few months of that, I managed to persuade him back down caves again. And he was a bit tentative the first few times, but it didn't take long before he was back to his old self, and if anything, with renewed vigour. I mean, he turned 60 by this stage, or wasn't far off it, and he really did have an enthusiasm that I hadn't seen for a long, long time.
About 3 or 4 years ago, when Mike came back to caving after quite a long spell, he wanted a project that he could do on his own, so he came up here to Bloke Pot, which is on near the Clapham Bottoms, and he wanted to start excavating the shaft. The shaft itself is about 15 metres deep, and he wanted to be able to haul buckets out by himself, and to do that he needed to put a beam across the hole for his pulley. So he asked me if I'd do a little bit of rock surgery on the ledge down here so that he could put his beam across for the pulley. He started digging it, but he soon found that it was a considerable effort and decided to move on to other things. His main projects at that time were, indeed over the last 3 years, have been rat holes and associated shafts in Gaping Gill. He's spent many, many hours, mostly on his own, drilling away, putting in new P-bolts, and it's now a tribute to him that the whole shaft is now properly bolted with P-hangers, and there are some very, very fine routes to be had in that system.
In my 30s I started running, and I set myself a challenge of doing the Fellsman, which is a 62-mile event running from Ingleton to Gressington. And I met this chap called Mike in the cafe that I was working at, and shared my interest. And of course I heard from him that he'd done the Fellsman many times successfully, and he decided he was going to help me out with my attempt to do it.
The morning came, and went to Ingleton where the Fellsman starts, and there's this older chap, Mike, and this was the guy that was going to take us round. And it became very apparent that this guy was really quite knowledgeable. He's done the Fellsman numerous times before, and he had a lot of wisdom.
As I got to know Mike as a very close friend and certainly a teacher and mentor, he let slip that his name was Mike Wooding, this very famous caver and cave diver from my past, and it was a lovely feeling. I was very glad to get to know him first and not as this Mike Wooding, because I think I would have been too petrified to get to know him.
His attention to detail became really very apparent. He'd know the way from almost nowhere on the ground. He'd know that we have to change bearings here, we have to go this direction.
At night time we'd come across a complete sparse fell side and a small rock, and he'd say, right, we need to take a 60 degree bearing from this rock. The rock was tiny, but he'd put that there 10 years previously.
There was head torches all over, all different directions, miles apart, and we just cut straight through the middle of them all and went straight to the checkpoint. And this was all Mike's doing. He had the bearings down to a fine art.
If the buckles were too heavy, he'd unstitch them and sew some new ones on. The ultimate was the last fellsman that we did together, when the night before he rang me up very excited. He'd saved another 6 grams. See if we'd notice. Well, the next day he turned up. We couldn't notice the 6 grams. We knew everything that he was wearing, everything that he was doing, and eventually announced he'd shaved his moustache off. How did he know it was 6 grams? Well, of course he'd weighed it.
He became attracted back into cave diving, and he had a few dives with people like Dave Brock. But he was particularly interested in Meargill Skit, which he felt was unfinished business. This was a cave that had been dived by Tom Brown in the early 70s, and Tom claimed to have gone down a shaft and along a passage for a long way. And when the dive was repeated, sure enough the shaft was there, but the passage petered out in a choke. And Mike was absolutely adamant that Tom was absolutely right in what he'd found, because everything tied up, the length of the time he was down there, and the amount of air he used, and so on and so forth. And he was convinced that there was a choke that had developed in the intervening years. And he thought that if he could make his way through that choke, then the way on would be open. Nice, new, big, unexplored passage heading off up the Meargill Fault. And so he started getting his gear together and developing his techniques again and all the rest of it, and spent time putting in eco bolts at the top of the drop down into the sump, and started going in there every Wednesday evening with a digging bucket, removing cobbles from the end and coming out. And he was doing it for 3 months, I think. On Thursday that Mike was found, I'd actually been caving on my own down Link Pot, and for some reason I decided to drive back through Chapelerdale. It was such a beautiful day, and I decided to drive home the long way round, and I saw Mike's car parked outside Meargill Skit. This was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I stopped the car and grabbed a light and popped into Meargill Skit, and sure enough his bags were there, but there's no sign of him, and I knew he would have had air for 40 minutes, for an hour, so I didn't want to hang around. So I came out and went home. And then about 6 o'clock that evening I was phoned up by Watto asking me whether I knew whether Mike had been diving that day. And it was at that stage I realised that Mike had probably been underwater since the evening before.
I suppose the core was that you're responsible for yourself cave diving, and it's your duty to get things right in your head and also in your equipment, and don't expect anybody to come to your aid. And I suppose that's why he thought, I'm just as well off going solo as in a team diving. And I think that ethos has probably persisted in cave diving, that really you're responsible for your own destiny and you don't rely on other people. It's not like ordinary caving where you expect to be fished out by the CRO or whatever.
The things that Mike was doing in the caving and cave diving world were, to us as schoolboys, almost superhuman. But as we began to rub shoulders with the top cavers at the time, we began to almost believe that we could possibly reach these heights ourselves. And he really nurtured that self-belief in myself. And Oliver Statham, I know, had a tremendous influence on him as well.
In my opinion, Mike was one of the great cavers ever. And we can all compile a list of our top 10 British cavers. And all the names would be slightly different, but I think that Mike's name would appear in most people's list. He basically broke the equivalent of the 4-minute mile barrier in cave diving. His trips down far waters, his solo trips down far waters, and his solo trips down Swildens, I think, are comparable to any trips done by anybody. I think one of the things that characterised Mike's caving was his methodical approach to it, the preparation, the careful preparation. He took over everything. Whether it was diving, standard caving, whether we were climbing in avens or anything else like that, he always had the right equipment with him. He never forgot a piece of equipment.
Mike has stayed in my mind like nobody else I know. I've kept in contact with him all these years for sure. And I think because he's that spiritual sort of bloke, I think he'll continue to live in that parallel world for a lot of people.